Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome Lisbeth Harbo from long-standing partners Nordregio in Stockholm. Yes. We've been working with Nordregio for many years. They're somewhat the equivalent of the Nord Institute in that part of the world. As you can see, they do address a lot of similar issues through research. They're real gurus at maps, so David, you're going to love this. And understanding demographic and social change in the north of Europe. So Lisbeth is here for our Demography Fest week, which includes, of course, watching this wonderful week. Thank you, I can go now. And it's also great to have the other international guests here, Paul Peters from the University of New Brunswick, and Doris, of course, who's returned home. Or
yes.
You don't have a home?
No.
Many homes. Sweden as well. But I'll let Lisbeth get on with telling us some interesting things about her work in the north of Europe. Thanks for presenting this, and we'll have some questions after it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for this invitation, Andrew, and thanks for that introduction. I will elaborate a little bit on what Nordregio does. We call ourselves the Nordic Centre for Spatial Development, and we are mandated by the Nordic Council of Ministers to work on regional development in the Nordic countries in the broader sense. We primarily work comparatively, either between the Nordic countries, but also in connection to Europe, within the Baltic Sea region, and also in a wider circumpolar Arctic setting. And sometimes we work more thematically, like with remote and sparsely populated areas, which is why I'm here today, I guess. And as Andrew said, we do a lot of our work through maps and analysis of maps, and you will certainly see that in a moment. But just to brush up on geography skills here, the main core area that we work in are the Nordic countries, and these are 5 countries and 3 autonomous regions, as we call them. The countries are Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. Then the autonomous regions are Greenland, Faroe Islands, up in the Atlantic Sea, and then the Åland Islands, which are here, located between Sweden and Finland. And for the purpose of today, have a look at this map and notice that the most urban areas are located to the south, because I will focus my talk today about our north. But just to give you an overview of the regions that we're working in and the size of the populations that we talk about, it's about 26 million altogether. Half of them are in the smaller areas. And then I use the EU membership as a proxy for the policy context that we work within. And even if Schengen, no Schengen, EU, no EU is its own little policy context, there's a lot of different exceptions and bilateral agreed agreements with the EU as well. Place, people and policy is also my structure for the day. I'll talk about our places first, then a bit about people and population development, and finally some policy considerations. That means also concentrating to the north. We work on the 4 countries, but only the northernmost part of Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and then Iceland, all of Greenland. We've zoomed in for scale purposes, and the Faroe Islands here. This region is obviously also the sparsely populated areas of the Nordic countries, but also of the EU. And as I'll come back to in a minute, a new label for this region is the Nordic Arctic. I've zoomed in a bit, but hopefully you can see that the areas in question are below the EU definition of sparsely populated areas, between 1 and 12.5 inhabitants per square kilometers, and Greenland obviously even lower. The term the Nordic Arctic is of course an outcome of the highly increased political attention to the Arctic region, and a lot of the strategies now, both from national level to EU level, are recognizing now this region as the Arctic of the North, so as to position the Nordic countries also in that discussion. But obviously it's also remote and rural and what else you will find of definitions here. However, when we talk about the Nordic Arctic, these kind of images probably pops up. These are all from Greenland and quite iconic, I think, for the way we think about the Arctic. It's snow, it's ice, it's subsistence, hunting, and all of these things. And while it's true that winter is a huge part of this region, of course, and snow as a condition that frame the life, we shouldn't forget that the Nordic Arctic is also this summer, even if short, but also a lot of forestry, natural resources, and mountains and green areas as well. These images also point to some of the resources in the region. The top left is the large iron ore in Kiruna. We have forestry, which is dominant in northern Finland and Sweden in particular. Aquaculture, breeding of salmon in these cages in fjords from the Faroe Islands, and then a summer photo from Greenland, which I had surprisingly few photos related to fishery and marine industries, but I guess these containers and the little ship can symbolize that. So it's a very diverse region, both with regards to the landscape, the resources, and the direct challenges. But the commonalities include a part dependency on the primary sector, some level of economic mobility by being dependent on either one sector or even one company places. And then, of course, the characteristics of remoteness, small numbers, sparse populations, long distances to particularly national centres. And the sense of EU, if we are talking in that context. And while we're looking at photos, I think we should also have a look at the settlements in question. They also represent a huge diversity. We have old merchant towns in Norway, we have wooden houses in small villages in both Greenland and Sweden, and we have very large, quite fancy villas in Iceland, apparently from some of those who made money before the crash of that. And then obviously we also have some large cities in the region symbolized by this graffiti mural, but over the capital regions in both Nuuk in Greenland, Tórshavn in the Faroe Islands, Reykjavik in Iceland, but also some fairly large centres in the north of Norway and Sweden and Finland. There's also quite a bit of diversity in housing found even in small settlements, the south of Greenland, but similar to blocks as well as single dwellings can be found in other parts of the region. The type of ownership varies quite a bit between the countries, but in general it's both public and private, differing between different types of settlements actually. But just to keep in mind that we're not talking only about the Swedish stugas or the big blocks in some of the mid-sized towns. And then let's turn to the people. Part of the people. The indigenous populations, I know that's interesting in here, in Australia. It's not a huge part of our research, mainly because the Nordic countries don't agree very much on the topic. But as you can hopefully see, the Samis in northern Norway, Sweden and Finland, they make up between 5 and 25% of the population there. It varies between the regions. Finnmark, Troms and Åland are 3 regions in Norway, and but it also varies within the regions and between the settlements. So some settlements are dominated by Samis, while others have very few Samis. One could argue that the Greenlanders should also be termed as their own people, like the Icelanders and the Faroese. But they have indigenous recognition in the EU, so they have been labeled as indigenous population here, but of course they make up the largest proportion of the population up there. Yeah, then of course, maybe I should mention that yes, we have indigenous people in the region, of course, but there's also large populations outside the region. For instance, there's a huge Sami population in Stockholm, and there's quite a big group of both Greenlanders and Faroese in Denmark due to their affiliation within the Kingdom of Denmark. So in the Nordic countries we have register data, which makes it possible to make some quite detailed analysis and on a variety of parameters and on different scales. What's available between the countries varies quite a bit. Therefore, it proves some problems when we want to do comparisons. But in general, you can get population data on the main variables like age, gender, income to some extent, marital status, and these kind of things. The main worry is to what degree you can get several variables within one data set and at what detailed level you can get this. But if we look at the Nordic as the whole region, with Denmark and all of Norway, Sweden and Finland, it has a growing population, 8.4 since year 2000, we've calculated. But this population growth is mainly due to immigration rather than natural growth. Think immigration surplused natural growth maybe even 20, 30 years ago. The population is increasingly concentrated in the cities, and it's a strongly aging population, both as a function of a current large generation due to the Second World War generation, as we call them, and that life length is increasing, especially among men, and then of course the low birth rates. But considering the urban growth and the map before, you would think that the Nordic Arctic region would be a region in stark decline, but actually the trends are similar to the overall image. It also has a growing population, looked as a whole, but at a slower speed, so obviously it's performing relatively worse than the whole region. But population growth is also due to immigration, and as we will see, population is also concentrating in the largest town and cities, and even in the Nordic Arctic region. And aging is also an issue. So it's not too bad, I suppose, compared to what it could have been. However, if we break it down below this pan-regional level, and here we've done it on municipal level, it shows strong disparities, and if you have local geographical knowledge, you can point out that all the bigger cities are located in the municipalities, in the blue municipalities. And if we break it down even further between below municipal level, because the municipal level is actually also averaging out quite a bit onto settlement level, it should be clear that also within the municipalities you see settlements in decline and settlements in growth. The circles represent the population of the place, and I think it's quite clear that the larger, the bluer, and even if it's not clear where the settlements in decline are located, it's still a remote issue of some kind. It's of course interesting to cross-analyze this with all the variables, and we'll tell more about the precise changes to the population structure. And in this I'm going to exemplify it with the general analysis. In previous analysis we've had age as the main component, which has shown that it's particularly the young people who leave the small settlements, moving to bigger cities for education purposes. But recently we also see a new trend of pensioners actually leaving. But it's a new thing we have to look more into. But we've done some rather simple analysis on gender just by looking at if there's a surplus or a lack of women in the different settlements. Because in addendum to the general age trends, there's also a gender bias in this, in that the more women move away, the Nordic women tend to have higher and longer educations than the men. And the women stay once they moved away, whereas the men have a tendency to rather be able to move back to where they came from. This causes some of the settlements, or first of all now the municipalities, but that they are either male dominated or female dominated. Since migration is such a big factor in this region, this map could just be dismissed as this is just international migration, which is primarily male. But if we look down on settlement level, again we see that it's the larger towns and cities that are dominated by women, and the smaller places which have a surplus of men. Yeah. The longevity is of course playing a role. There used to be a surplus of women in the Nordic Arctic region altogether. And we would have liked to have some cross-references that would take this component out, so we could do analysis on the two variables of age and gender. But even if I praised the registered statistics before, it has some limitations, so we're still working on getting this data down on settlement level. So the consequences of these, particularly for the small municipalities, and I should probably just mention that the municipalities are very small. I mean, some of them only have like 48 inhabitants, while others around the towns, of course, have about 100,000. So they vary quite a bit. But a thing about the Nordic welfare states is that all municipalities have the same responsibility, regardless of size. So that means from a municipal administration point of view, this population decline means that one thing is that they have lack of labor for the local place-based industries. The companies in the region in general are crying for labor, and particularly this labor with the right skills. But for municipality it also means that the tax base for providing these services is eroding, meaning that they cannot actually provide the public service that the inhabitants are asking for, and which they are obliged by their contracts with the national level to provide. And at the same time they're having an aging population, so the demands for these services are also increasing. And then of course, since I brought up gender, you can ask, what does this matter? And it may not be a gender perspective as much as a family perspective, because of course if you have fewer women, you have fewer children in the villages. That means if it's a small settlement, you close down maybe the school, which was the last sort of meeting point in the village, and it may cause other families to move away, and it becomes even more difficult to attract people back to these villages with no services. Another issue is that women often work in the public sector providing these services, and particularly providing the care and health services to the aging population. And then I put in the question about the Scandinavian norm of dual income families, because with more and more women having higher and higher levels of education, and their expectations of actually putting this education to use also means that it's difficult for women to find suitable jobs in the small places. So again, from a family perspective, the family as a whole may be better off living somewhere else. And turning a bit to policy, because with such a diverse region that we're looking at, and therefore it's difficult to go into detail with every country's response to the depopulation issue and what to do about the small settlements. But when we look in general what they're thinking in the policy world, there's still a huge focus on growth. More jobs will attract more citizens, and that has its own little catch-22, because the companies are already trying for labor. But of course, moving some of the primary industries up the value chain, or exploring into new sectors that could maybe be more interesting for instance, women, is brought on the table. And then I mentioned administrative reforms, which may be a little funny as a response, but considering that the municipalities are so small, the thinking has been that we need to increase the tax base, and I had another slide for this. First of all, maybe it's an acknowledgement that the urban structure is just different now than when these structures were set up, sometimes quite a long time ago. Example is from Iceland, where they have been gradually merging municipalities. And then, of course, they want to mitigate for the lack of tax bases, thinking that if we have a larger tax base, the municipality is better able to provide some of these services. And then, of course, there's the economy of scale thinking, in that fewer units will have fewer administrative costs. And there has been already a reform in Greenland and also one in Denmark. And economies of scale in administration costs is probably not the solution in the short-term perspective. I mean, reforming costs money, and a whole transformation of who's doing what and responsibilities, and that is difficult. And then, of course, it can also be speculated. I mean, what does this do about the depopulation issues? It's sort of a concrete action that will help this. Then attracting new inhabitants is a general trend. We've had an enormous variety of actions for this: branding campaigns, profiling of the regions, urban regenerations in larger places, but in the small places also they work with different ideas of local ambassadors, having ties to these students that move away, various local development projects that should increase local enthusiasm and things like that. Cluster villages is an issue where you would, if they located close enough, you would have 3 villages that would then share some public services like sports centre or other things like that. And then very recently, only within the last couple of years, Immigrants has shown up on the table, because as I almost showed you, the international net migration is very high in the region, particularly in the north of Scandinavia and to some extent in Iceland. Greenland and the Faroes do not have immigrants, more or less. And a lot of these, not 2015, a lot of these have, of course, been refugees, but previous to this, a lot of these are EU migrant workers who've been commuting in and out for jobs, and now we see policy attempts at actually trying to convince these people who are already in the region that they should actually settle permanently and bring their families, and thus give some more inhabitants to the small places.
Lisbeth, sorry.
Yeah.
Percentage of the resident population, is that? What's the percentage of in your scale? So if it's 0.5% of the resident population is being contributed?
Yes, it must be. Yeah. So then I just poured so what are the future for these small Nordic settlements? I call it prioritizations between the small settlements because it's happening whether they want it or not by this that the municipalities aren't able to provide services, and that there's this vicious circle about, people moving away, people unable to sell their houses, nobody daring to buy a house in the small places. So of course there's an unplanned decline by not doing anything. The question of planned prioritization, I'm supposed to put it nicely, is on the table in Greenland at the moment. Some of the settlements are very small, and one has 7 males. And of course, in a bad economic climate, you start on national level to consider whether the cost of running these places are viable or not. It's a very controversial question in all places, but maybe even more so in Greenland, I think. Then I use the term incommuting settlements because in the Nordic countries we have no tradition of having fly-in, fly-out workforce to the same extent that we see elsewhere. The idea is that there should be a living community surrounding these businesses, and that there's some sort of stable population, and maybe it's necessary to start accepting that there will be some of these large mining companies, for instance, where they just use fly-in, fly-out workers. But this will also mean an end to the equality principle between the Nordic municipalities. The general idea is that everywhere you live, you should have equal access to equal service. And if you start accepting that some municipalities may not be able to provide the services that they are obliged to, you kind of start operating with a 2-level municipality. And the discussion at the moment is very much about what would be the consequences if you're living in if you accept living in a municipality with a lower level of service provision. Is that democratic, first of all? And secondly, is that just increasing the vicious circle that then nobody wants to move to that municipality since they can't have whatever disabled aid for their children or what it could be? So it's very, very difficult questions, but a lot of these issues are now on the agenda, so I think there's a general feeling that we need to address these questions. And then how to do it, and if there can be political agreement about doing something, or just a lot of discussion is of course another issue. So, thanks.